Germany thought they had the best tanks in the world. Then they met the T-34. And for the first time since the war started, German tank crews felt real fear. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa was supposed to be quick. Hitler told his generals they'd be in Moscow by autumn. The German army had crushed Poland in weeks. France fell in just over a month. Their Panzer division seemed unstoppable. Every tank battle had been a victory. Every enemy they faced crumbled under their armor. But on a dusty road in western Ukraine, everything changed. A German Panzer crew saw something rolling toward them through the fields. It looked like a tank, but not like any tank they'd ever seen before. The commander raised his binoculars. What he saw made his blood run cold. This is the story of how one Soviet tank design shocked the entire German army, how it forced them to completely rethink everything they knew about armored warfare, and how it changed the course of World War II. Let me take you back to understand why this was such a big deal. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union, they had three main tanks: the Panzer III, the Panzer IV, and some older Panzer IIs that were already outdated. The Panzer III was their main battle tank. It had a 50 gun. Not huge, but it worked fine against Polish and French tanks. The Panzer IV was bigger with a short 75 gun, but it was mainly used for supporting infantry, not fighting other tanks. German tank crews were confident. They had reason to be. They'd beaten everyone they'd fought. Their tactics were better. Their training was better. Their coordination with aircraft and infantry was the best in the world. Blitzkrieg wasn't just about having good tanks. It was about using everything together perfectly. So when they rolled into Soviet territory, they expected more of the same. Sure, they knew the Soviets had a lot of tanks. Intelligence reports said the Red Army had thousands of them, but German commanders weren't worried about numbers. They'd faced numerical superiority before and won. The first week seemed to prove them right. Soviet resistance was chaotic. German forces pushed deep into Soviet territory. Hundreds of Soviet tanks were destroyed or abandoned. Tank crews that survived reported the same thing. The Soviet BT tanks were fast but lightly armored. German guns punched through them easily. The T-26 was slow and even more vulnerable. The multi-turret T-35 was a joke, breaking down constantly and making easy targets. German reports back to headquarters were optimistic. The Soviet tank force seemed like it would be no problem at all. Outdated designs, poor training, bad tactics. This was going to be easier than France. Then the T-34 showed up. The date was June 23, 1941, just 2 days after the invasion started. The 4th Panzer Division was advancing near the town of Rethink in Lithuania. They'd been making good progress. Soviet forces were falling back in disorder. Everything was going according to plan. Then a call came over the radio. One of the forward units had engaged Soviet tanks, but something was wrong. The voice on the radio sounded panicked. Their shots weren't penetrating. The Soviet tanks were destroying Panzers with single hits. The unit was requesting immediate support. This didn't make sense. Soviet tanks weren't supposed to do this. The division commander sent more Panzers forward to help. What happened next would be talked about in German tank units for the rest of the war. A Soviet KV-1 heavy tank along with several T-34s had blocked the main road. The KV-1 sat there alone at one point, holding up the entire German advance for a full day. German Panzer IIIs fired at it from close range. Their 37 and 50 shells just bounced off. They might as well have been throwing rocks. The tank's armor was too thick. The angles were too sloped. But it was the T-34s that really worried the Germans. The KV-1 was slow. You could maybe work around it. The T-34 was fast, faster than German tanks, and it had the same problem. German shells weren't penetrating. One Panzer commander later wrote in his report, "We fired at them from 800 meters. Nothing. We closed to 400 meters. Still nothing. We could see our shells hitting, but they just ricocheted off. Then they fired back. One shot. One of our tanks exploded. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't what intelligence had told them. This wasn't what anyone expected. More reports started coming in from other parts of the front. T-34s were showing up everywhere. And everywhere they showed up, German tank crews were shocked by the same things. The armor was too thick. The gun was too powerful. The speed was too high. German Panzers that got into fights with T-34s were losing. Let me tell you what made the T-34 so special. Because this is where Soviet tank designers had done something really clever. Most tanks at the time had fairly flat armor plates, vertical or close to it. The reason was simple. It's easier to manufacture, easier to assemble. But there's a problem with flat armor. When a shell hits it straight on, all the energy goes into trying to punch through. The Soviets had been thinking about this since the 1930s. An American designer named J. Walter Christie had created a suspension system that allowed for both speed and sloped armor. The Soviets bought the design and improved on it. They realized that if you angle the armor, shells are more likely to bounce off. Even if they don't bounce, the effective thickness is much greater because the shell has to go through more metal at an angle. The T-34 took this idea and ran with it. The front armor was sloped at 60 degrees. The sides were angled too. This meant that the 45 mm frontal armor was effectively much thicker. German 37 guns couldn't touch it. Even the 50 guns on later Panzer IIIs struggled unless they got a perfect side shot at close range. But it wasn't just the armor. The T-34 had a 76 gun. This was a much bigger gun than what was on German tanks at the time. It fired a heavier shell at higher velocity, and it could penetrate German Panzer armor from ranges where German guns couldn't hurt the T-34. Think about what this meant in combat. A T-34 could sit at 1,000 meters away and destroy German tanks. The German tanks couldn't shoot back effectively. They had to close the distance. But the T-34 was faster than them. It could choose whether to fight or run. It controlled the engagement. The speed came from that Christie suspension I mentioned. It gave the T-34 incredible mobility for its weight. The tank could do 55 kilometers per hour on roads. That's faster than a Panzer III or IV. It also had wide tracks that distributed its weight better. This meant it could cross soft ground that German tanks would get stuck in. Mud, snow, sand. It handled it all better. And there was one more thing. The T-34 ran on a diesel engine, not gasoline. Diesel is less flammable than gasoline. German tanks ran on gas, and when they got hit, they often caught fire. The crews called them Ronsons, after the lighter company, because they lit up every time. The T-34 was much less likely to burn, which meant the crew had a better chance of surviving if they got hit. Now I have to be honest here. The T-34 wasn't perfect. Far from it. It had serious problems. The biggest one was the turret. Early T-34s only had a two-man turret. The commander had to aim and fire the gun himself. In German tanks, the commander could focus on commanding while the gunner handled shooting. This gave German tanks better situational awareness and faster reaction times. The vision devices in the T-34 were also terrible. The crew had very limited ability to see out. German tanks had better optics and more viewing ports. In a battle where seeing the enemy first could mean life or death, this was a major disadvantage. They also had reliability issues early on. The transmission was problematic. It was hard to shift gears. Crews sometimes needed a hammer to change gears. The clutch would wear out quickly. The air filters let in dust that damaged engines. Soviet tank factories were churning out T-34s as fast as possible, and quality control wasn't always great. But here's the thing. None of that mattered in June 1941, because even with all its flaws, the T-34 was still better than what the Germans had. The armor and gun advantage was so huge that it overcame all the other problems. Back at German headquarters, reports about the T-34 were causing serious concern. This wasn't supposed to happen. German military planning assumed they had technological superiority. That assumption was now in question. General Heinz Guderian was one of the top German tank commanders. He's the guy who basically invented modern armored warfare tactics. When he first encountered T-34s, he was stunned. He later wrote, "The T-34 was the best tank in the world in 1941. Our tanks were inferior in armor, armament, and cross-country mobility." That's a pretty big admission from the man who just led the most successful tank campaigns in history. The German Army High Command started demanding answers. How did Soviet tank designers create something this good? How many of them were there? Why didn't intelligence know about this? The truth was embarrassing. German intelligence had known about the T-34, sort of. They had reports that the Soviets were developing new tanks, but the estimates of Soviet industrial capacity were way too low. Nobody thought the Soviets could mass-produce an advanced tank design. Soviet industry was supposed to be backward and inefficient. That's what everyone assumed. Turns out everyone was wrong. The Soviets had been preparing for war with Germany for years. They'd built huge tank factories. They'd trained thousands of workers. They'd stockpiled materials. And they designed the T-34 to be simple enough to mass-produce, but advanced enough to dominate the battlefield. By mid-1941, Soviet factories were producing T-34s at a rate German industry couldn't match. Even as the German army advanced and captured Soviet territory, even as they destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks, more T-34s kept appearing. German tank crews started changing their tactics out of necessity. They learned not to engage T-34s from the front if they could help it. They learned to use ambush tactics, trying to get side shots where the armor was slightly thinner. They learned to use their better optics and crew coordination to spot T-34s first and maybe get the first shot off. The 88 anti-aircraft gun became the go-to weapon for stopping T-34s. The 88 was a big, powerful gun designed to shoot down high-altitude bombers. It could penetrate T-34 armor. German commanders started using 88 guns in an anti-tank role more and more. But the 88 was huge. It was hard to move around. It was vulnerable to artillery and air attack. And there weren't enough of them. Some German units tried more desperate measures. They would try to get close enough to throw explosives onto the tank. They would try to damage the tracks to immobilize it, then attack it with engineers carrying demolition charges. These tactics sometimes worked, but they were dangerous and costly. The Panzer crews themselves started showing signs of what we now call combat stress. Before Barbarossa, German tank crews felt nearly invincible. Now they were facing an enemy that outgunned them and could shrug off their weapons. Tank combat became a psychological nightmare. You'd see a T-34. You'd fire at it. Your shot would bounce off. Then you'd see the enemy turret turn toward you. You knew what was coming next, and there wasn't much you could do about it. Letters home from the front started reflecting this new reality. Soldiers who'd written confidently about quick victory in June were writing nervously about Soviet tanks in July and August. The myth of German invincibility was cracking. Now, before we make it sound like the T-34 single-handedly stopped the Germans, we need to talk about why it didn't. Because here's the reality. Despite having this amazing tank, the Soviets still lost huge amounts of territory in 1941. The Germans still pushed to the gates of Moscow. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. Thousands of T-34s were destroyed or abandoned. How did this happen if the T-34 was so good? The answer comes down to everything else. The T-34 was a fantastic machine, but it was only as good as the people using it and the system supporting it. Soviet tank crews in 1941 were often poorly trained. Stalin's purges in the late 1930s had killed or imprisoned many experienced tank officers. The guys who knew how to use tanks effectively were gone. They'd been replaced with officers chosen for political loyalty rather than military skill. Training programs were rushed. New crews got maybe a few weeks of training before being sent to the front. Compare that to German tank crews who trained for months. A German Panzer commander knew his crew. They'd worked together. They understood each other. Many Soviet T-34 crews were strangers thrown together days before combat. Radio equipment was another huge problem. Many T-34s didn't have radios. Only the platoon commander's tank would have one. The other tanks in the platoon had to follow by watching flags or trying to see what the commander was doing. You can imagine how well that worked in the chaos of battle. German tanks all had radios, every single one. This meant German tank platoons could coordinate their movements, call for support, share information about enemy positions. Soviet tank platoons often couldn't communicate at all once the battle started. Soviet tactics were also outdated at the start of the war. They'd throw tanks forward in mass attacks without proper infantry support or reconnaissance. German anti-tank guns would be hidden and waiting. The T-34s would roll forward, and even though they could take a few hits, concentrated fire from multiple guns would eventually knock them out. There was also the supply problem. The German advance in 1940 was so fast that Soviet units were often cut off from fuel and ammunition supplies. You'd have perfectly good T-34s abandoned by the side of the road because they ran out of diesel, or they'd be sitting there unable to fight because they had no ammunition. Maintenance was another issue. T-34s broke down a lot in 1941. When they broke down, there often weren't spare parts or trained mechanics to fix them. German tanks had their own reliability issues, but the German army had a much better logistics and maintenance system. They could usually recover and repair damaged tanks. The Soviets often had to abandon theirs. So you had this situation where the Soviets had the better tank, but the Germans were still winning. The T-34 gave Soviet forces a fighting chance in tank battles, but it couldn't overcome all the other disadvantages the Red Army faced in 1941. But here's where the story gets really interesting. Because the T-34 didn't just scare the Germans, it forced them to change. In late 1941, Hitler called a meeting with his top tank designers and generals. The message was clear. Germany needed a response to the T-34. They needed it fast. The easiest solution was to upgrade existing tanks. The Panzer IV started getting a longer, more powerful 75 gun. This new gun could penetrate armor from reasonable ranges. Suddenly, the Panzer IV went from a support tank to Germany's main tank killer. They also started adding more armor to German tanks, though they couldn't match the sloped design without completely redesigning everything. But upgrades to old tanks weren't enough. Germany needed new designs. This led to two of the most famous tanks of World War II, the Panther and the Tiger. The Panther was basically Germany's answer to the T-34. It had sloped armor like the T-34. It had a powerful 75 gun that could destroy any Allied tank. It was fast and mobile. German designers had literally studied captured T-34s and copied the things that worked. Hitler himself was impressed by the T-34 and demanded German tanks match it. The Panther was an excellent tank. In many ways it was better than the T-34. Better optics, better crew layout, better gun. But it was complicated, it was expensive, it took longer to build. Germany could never produce Panthers as fast as the Soviets produced T-34s. The Tiger was a different approach. If you can't match the T-34's balance of speed, armor, and firepower, just go all in on armor and firepower. The Tiger had 100 mm frontal armor. It had an 88 mm gun. It could destroy a T-34 from over 2,000 meters away, from ranges where the T-34 couldn't even shoot back. But the Tiger was slow, it was heavy, it was mechanically complicated. It broke down constantly, and it cost a fortune. Germany built less than 1,500 Tigers during the entire war. The Soviets built over 80,000 T-34s. The T-34 had forced Germany into an arms race they couldn't win. Germany started producing better tanks, but they couldn't produce them fast enough. Every Panther or Tiger took resources that could have built several Panzer IVs. And while German tanks got better, so did Soviet tanks. The Soviets weren't sitting still. They upgraded the T-34 too. The T-34-85 came out in 1944 with a bigger 85mm gun and a three-man turret that fixed the commander problem. This new version could fight Panthers on more equal terms. The T-34's impact went beyond just tank battles. It affected German strategy and resource allocation for the entire war. Germany had to divert resources to tank development and production that could have gone elsewhere. They had to pull experienced workers from other industries to build complicated tanks like the Panther. They had to use scarce resources like steel and oil to build and operate heavy tanks. The existence of the also affected German offensive planning. German commanders couldn't just assume their panzers would dominate the battlefield anymore. They had to plan for tough tank battles. They had to allocate more anti-tank weapons to infantry units. They had to be more cautious about where they committed their armor. This slowed down German offensives. The quick breakthroughs of 1941 became harder to achieve. By 1942, Soviet tank forces were a real threat that had to be taken seriously. By 1943, at battles like Kursk, German and Soviet tank forces were fairly evenly matched, and the Soviets had way more tanks. The psychological impact was huge too. German soldiers had started the war believing they were technologically superior to everyone. They shattered that belief. Soviet equipment wasn't inferior anymore. In some ways it was better. That realization spread beyond just tank crews to the entire German army. For the Soviets, the T-34 was a massive morale boost. They had something they could be proud of. Soviet tankers knew they were driving the best tank in the world in 1941. That confidence helped offset some of the other disadvantages they faced. They also became a symbol of Soviet industrial might. This wasn't some rushed copy of a Western design. This was a genuinely innovative Soviet creation that beat the Germans at their own game. Soviet propaganda made good use of that. Let me tell you some numbers that really show why the T-34 mattered so much. In 1941, Germany produced about 3,800 tanks of all types. The Soviet Union produced about 6,600 tanks, including over 2,800 T-34s. And this was the year when Germany captured huge amounts of Soviet territory and industrial capacity. In 1942, Germany produced about 6,200 tanks. The Soviets produced over 24,000 tanks, including more than 12,000 T-34s. By 1943, Germany was producing more advanced tanks like the Panther, but they were only making about 12,000 tanks total per year. The Soviets were producing over 24,000 T-34s alone, not counting other tank types. The gap just kept growing. Germany couldn't keep up. And remember, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts. They needed tanks for North Africa, then Italy, then France after D-Day. The Soviets could concentrate almost all their tank production on the Eastern Front. This production advantage came from the T-34's design. It was designed to be mass-produced. It used simple parts where possible. It didn't have complicated systems that required precision manufacturing. Soviet factories could train new workers quickly to build T-34s. German tanks, especially the later ones, were over-engineered. They required skilled workers. They needed precision parts. They took longer to build. A Panther took about 150,000 man-hours to produce. A took about 8,000 man-hours. Soviet factories also did something clever. They simplified the T-34 design as the war went on. They removed unnecessary features. They made parts easier to manufacture. This meant they could build T-34s even faster and cheaper over time. There's a story that really captures this difference. A German general visited a captured Soviet tank factory after the war. He looked at the T-34 production line and asked how the Soviets got such good performance from such crude manufacturing methods. The Soviet engineer showed him around. Everything was designed for speed and simplicity. The German general realized that while German industry was focused on building the best possible tank, Soviet industry was focused on building enough good tanks to win the war. It's the classic quality versus quantity debate. Except the T-34 had both enough quality to be effective and the quantity to overwhelm the Germans. They fought in every major battle on the Eastern Front. Let me tell you about a few moments where it really made the difference. The Battle of Moscow in late 1941 was the first time the Germans really felt the full impact of the T-34. Fresh Soviet tank brigades equipped with T-34s helped stop the German advance. German tank crews reported that fighting T-34s in the snow and mud around Moscow was a nightmare. The wide tracks and good mobility meant it could maneuver where German tanks got stuck. At Stalingrad in 1942, T-34s were used in urban combat. This wasn't ideal for them. Tank-on-tank battles in cities are brutal, and this poor visibility became even more of a handicap. But Soviet crews adapted. They learned to use the T-34's speed to rush positions, fire, and pull back before German anti-tank guns could respond. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 was the largest tank battle in history. This was where German Panthers and Tigers faced off against masses of T-34s. German tanks had better guns and armor by this point, but the Soviets had way more tanks. The result was brutal attrition warfare. Germany lost tanks they couldn't replace. The Soviets lost more tanks total, but they could replace them. Individual T-34 crews became famous. There are stories of single T-34s holding off entire German columns, of T-34s that took dozens of hits and kept fighting, of crews that destroyed 10 or more German tanks in a single battle. One famous story involves a T-34 commander named Dmitry Lavrenenko. He's credited with destroying 52 German tanks in just 2.5 months in 1941. That's more than almost any other tank commander in history. He did it all in a T-34, using the tank's mobility and gun to outfight better-trained German crews. Another story is about a female tank commander named Maria Oktyabskaya. She bought a T-34 with her own money after her husband was killed and named it Fighting Girlfriend. She fought in multiple battles and became famous for dismounting under fire to repair her tank during combat. These stories became part of Soviet wartime propaganda. The T-34 and its crews were heroes. They represented Soviet strength and determination. The propaganda value of the T-34 was almost as important as its military value. As the war went on, both the T-34 and German tanks continued to evolve, but the fundamental reality stayed the same. The Soviets had more tanks and their tanks were good enough. The T-34-85 that appeared in 1944 was a major upgrade. The bigger gun meant it could engage Panthers and Tigers more effectively. The three-man turret fixed the commander issue. Soviet crews finally had a tank that matched the Germans in most areas and still had the production advantage. By 1944, Soviet tank tactics had also evolved massively. Crews were better trained. Officers were more experienced. Radios were more common. Supply and maintenance improved. The Red Army learned how to use tanks effectively in combined arms operations, just like the Germans did. The result was devastating for Germany. When the Soviets launched major offensives in 1944 and 1945, They used T-34s in massive armored spearheads that punched through German lines. The same Blitzkrieg tactics the Germans had used in 1940 were now being used against them. German tank production by late 1944 was a mess. Allied bombing had disrupted factories. Resources were scarce. The tanks they did produce were often excellent machines like the Panther or King Tiger, but there were never enough of them, and they were so complicated that keeping them running was a constant struggle. Meanwhile, T-34s just kept rolling off the production lines. Soviet factories had been relocated beyond the Ural Mountains where German bombers couldn't reach them. They had access to resources. They had trained workers. Production increased every year. By the time the war ended, the Soviets had built over 80,000 T-34s in all variants. Germany built about 25,000 tanks of all types during the entire war. That's the impact of focusing on a design that worked and could be mass-produced. The T-34 story didn't end in 1945. It became one of the most widely used tanks in history. After World War II, the Soviet Union exported T-34s to communist allies around the world. They fought in Korea in the 1950s, where they outclassed early American tanks and forced the U.S. to develop better armor. They fought in the Middle East in conflicts between Israel and Arab states. They showed up in Vietnam, in Africa, in South America. Some T-34s are still in service today in very small numbers, mostly in really poor countries or as ceremonial vehicles. That's over 80 years after the design first appeared. Very few weapon systems in history have had that kind of longevity. The T-34 influenced tank design for decades. The idea of sloped armor became standard. The focus on a balance between firepower, armor, and mobility became the goal for every tank designer. Soviet tanks after the T-34, like the T-54 and T-72, followed the same basic philosophy. Western tank designers learned from the T-34 too. American and British tanks in the later stages of World War II started incorporating more sloped armor. Post-war tanks like the M48 Patton showed clear influence from T-34 design principles. So why does the T-34 matter so much? Why is it considered one of the most important weapons of World War II? First, it changed the tactical situation on the Eastern Front. German forces had to completely rethink how they fought tank battles. They couldn't assume technological superiority anymore. This forced them to develop new weapons and tactics, which took time and resources away from other priorities. Second, it proved that Soviet industry and design could compete with or beat the Germans. This was a huge psychological blow to Germany and a huge boost to Soviet morale. The myth of German invincibility died partly because of the T-34. Third, it showed the value of designing weapons for mass production. The T-34 wasn't the most advanced tank in every category, but it was good enough, and there were so many of them that it didn't matter. This lesson influenced military procurement for the rest of the 20th century. Fourth, it demonstrated how important it is to balance different factors in weapon design: armor, firepower, mobility, reliability, ease of production, ease of maintenance. The T-34 got that balance right. German tanks often sacrificed some of these factors to maximize others, and it hurt them. And finally, it showed how a single weapon system can have strategic impact beyond just its battlefield performance. They forced Germany to divert resources, change strategies, and ultimately contributed to their defeat. That's about as important as a weapon can be. I want to end by talking about the people who fought in and against these machines, because that's really what mattered. German tank crews in 1940, one went from confident veterans to scared soldiers facing an enemy they couldn't easily beat. Soviet tank crews went from poorly trained cannon fodder to skilled fighters who knew they had a weapon that could win. Think about what it was like to be in a Panzer III in the summer of 1941, shooting at a T-34 and watching your shells bounce off, knowing that if it turns its gun toward you, you're probably dead. That's terrifying. Or think about being in a T-34 with terrible visibility, unable to see what's around you, with a commander who's also trying to load and fire the gun, knowing that German tanks have better optics and will probably see you first. That's scary too. The interesting thing is that both sides adapted. German tank crews learned to use terrain better, to set ambushes, to aim for weak spots. Soviet tank crews learned to use their advantages in speed and armor. Both sides developed respect for the other. There are accounts from after the war where German and Soviet veterans met and talked about their experiences. They had mutual respect. They'd all been through the same hell, just from different sides. The T-34 crews respected how skilled German tank crews were. German crews respected how tough and determined Soviet tankers were. War is ultimately about people, not machines. The T-34 was a great machine, but it was the people who built it, maintained it, and fought in it who really mattered. Soviet workers who spent 12-hour shifts in factories building tanks, mechanics who kept them running in freezing temperatures, crews who climbed into these metal boxes knowing they might not come back. The same goes for the Germans. Tank crews who had to face an enemy that outgunned them, engineers who desperately tried to design counters, factory workers who built increasingly complicated tanks under Allied bombing raids. They shocked Germany not just because it was a good tank, but because it represented Soviet determination to win at any cost. It represented industrial mobilization on a scale the Germans couldn't match. It represented a willingness to sacrifice quality for quantity when quantity was what mattered. When German tank crews first encountered the T-34 in June 1941, they realized the war wasn't going to be quick or easy. That shock rippled through the entire German army. It was the beginning of the end of German confidence, and it was the beginning of Soviet hope that they could actually win this war. The T-34 didn't win World War II by itself, but it gave the Soviets a fighting chance when they desperately needed one, and it scared the Germans at exactly the moment when they thought they were invincible. That's why it mattered. That's why we still talk about it today. So there you have it, the story of how a Soviet tank design shocked the German army and changed World War II. The appeared when Germany thought they'd already won. It proved them wrong. It forced them to change everything about how they approached armored warfare. And ultimately, it helped ensure that Germany couldn't win the war in the East. The T-34 wasn't perfect. It had flaws, but it had the right combination of features at the right time. Good armor, good gun, good mobility, easy to produce. That combination beat German tanks that were better in individual categories but couldn't be produced fast enough. It's a reminder that in war, having the best weapon doesn't always matter as much as having enough good weapons. And it's a reminder that sometimes the underdog has surprises up their sleeve that can change everything. The German tank crews who first faced the T-34 in 1941 never forgot that moment. For the first time, they felt fear. For the first time, they realized this war might not go the way they expected. And they were right. Check out the next video to learn more about the World War II.